Okay, today we are going to talk about South Asian architecture. You'll have to excuse my voice a little bit. I am getting over a cold. This is the best I've sounded in several days, so hopefully you can understand me well enough. The first thing we need to talk about with South Asian architecture is the ancient Indus or Harappan architecture. This occurred in about 3300 BC to 1700 BC. This is the first form of architecture that we see in the area, and based on the time, you can see that it's comparable to when Mesopotamia was also building stuff. So this kind of happened concurrently. So a lot of their structures were made with mud brick walls, and these were actually fire mud bricks. They're not the ones that are sun baked like you saw in Mesopotamia. These were actually fired in kilns to create them. You'd see houses with courtyards. And a lot of these were actually very civic in nature. You don't see like palaces and stuff like that like you did in like Mesopotamia and in Egypt. Larger cities would have bathing houses, they'd had drainage systems, toilets, and grain warehouses. So they were fairly advanced and they were focused on, again, more civic things rather than like having a ruler and have them have like a big elaborate building. After the Harappan area, we move on to post Mahajapanpadis. You have to excuse me. Again, have a cold, hard to pronounce some words. This happened about 600 BC to 200 AD, and this was heavily influenced by Buddhism. And this is where you see a lot of, even in modern times, a lot of ways that Buddhist temples are constructed now go all the way back to this period where you see the stupa and the Torana. So the stupa is this dome-shaped building, and this was like a Buddhist type. I guess you could call it like a Buddhist temple where they would keep artifacts inside. And this is the Torana. If you've ever seen any kind of Buddhist temple, even in modern built ones, you see a lot of the similar shapes used in those structures. So these are primarily built with brick and wood. Um, and also during this period, they started building things called stepwells. And it's a well to get water. Um, and those are pretty iconic with this period. And even though these were built a long time ago, you'll still see these today. And well doesn't sound that impressive, but what it kind of was this giant, and you can see the size of the stairs and the size of the doors, almost like a giant pit where you'd walk down the stairs to get to the water, for drinking water, washing water, whatever you needed it for. Cities were also built during this time, and they, in general, would be surrounded by walls and moats with a large gate to get into them. Kind of moving on, these next couple are going to kind of be during the same kind of time period after the last one we talked about, but kind of spread out throughout South Asia. So the first one we're going to talk about is Kalinga architecture. You found this in eastern India. And the big part of this was having how temples were made, and it's really interesting what these looked like. Temples were made in two parts. You had the tower, which you can see back here, and you can see the hall up here. And these had very lavishly sculpted figures on them. You can kind of see some right here of figures and ornamentation, and also the use of horseshoe shapes. One of the most famous ones is called the Sun Temple, and that is this one right here. And it was actually shaped like a giant chariot. You can see the wheels on the front right here to give it its chariot sort of look. So this would be kind of being pulled. Um, that's what the shape was meant to be. Moving on to southern India, you have the Dravidian architecture. And while there are some similarities, there are some noticeable differences that you should be able to look at and be able to tell the difference between Kalinga and Dravidian, and also the next one. Um, The big one is they did have a lot of pyramid-shaped towers, and they used horizontal lines. If you kind of look at all of these, you can see a lot of horizontal line use in them. And rather than in the Kalinga one, where it looks like it's built up, a lot of Dravidian architecture was actually cut from the rock, like itself in the mountains. If you can see, this is cut down from the side of this mountain. It wasn't built up from it. So a lot of skill went into carving out these temples from the rock itself. And one of the other big features with Dravidian architecture is this little onion dome on the top. You'll find, since this is cut from the mountains itself most of the time, it's usually constructed of sandstone, soapstone, and granite. Kind of moving to the west of India, you had the Chalukya architecture, so Western Chalukya architecture. And again, you see some similarities, but there are some differences. Pillars were a big thing. You see the posts and lintels. Very similar to what was going on in the West as well. And you also see the these guys right here. These are the Kurtimukas. They're supposed to be kind of like monstery kind of things with big, wide mouths with sharp teeth. Is a religious sort of thing. You can look up more information about them, but if you see one of these things, it's usually associated with the style. Obviously, as architecture progressed, you see it appearing in more motifs, but this is where they really first started to appear. But you can definitely see a difference in this one as well. It doesn't quite have, it has a dome, but it's not like that onion dome on top. These were also usually built with soapstone. That's why a lot of the stone has like that greenish sort of look to it. So while they are built at the same time, they definitely have their slight differences that make them distinguishable. Kind of moving on, kind of pushing past, excuse me, the Western Chalukya came the Hoysala architecture in southwest India. It's very similar. Like, you can see some similar colors and kind of some similar shapes going on, but they really pushed the detail in the sculpture. This is an interior, and you can see this is like part of a domed roof. You can see how much craftsmanship went in to make this. This is carved out of stone. It's not like wood or anything. A lot of skill went into these buildings. So it's kind of taking what came before it and pushing it even more. You also get the Vijayanagara architecture in South India, again, pushing off of previous architectures. You see it used in religious, royal, and civic buildings, and these were primarily made of schist and soapstone, and sometimes granite was used. And the big difference, though, that you see in this style of architecture that you don't really see in previous styles is that they would plaster over the surface and paint them up. So it's kind of hard to see in these far shots, but if you look at temples from this period up close, you can see that they're actually very ornately painted. So that's one way to tell if you are looking at this style of architecture, is if it has like that painted sort of look to it. Moving on. In the 7th century, you do get Indo-Islamic architecture found in South Asia. And a lot of this is just review from when we talked about Islamic architecture. You should see a lot of similarities to that in these images, where you use the calligraphy as ornamentation. You don't see the carved figures anymore. It's more about those geometric shapes, excuse me, and calligraphy. You also see the use of the different types of arches that you usually found in Islamic architecture as well. And kind of pushing off of that, you got Mughal architecture. This was found in the 16th to 18th centuries. And it's kind of a conglomerate of Islamic, Persian, Turkish, and Indian styles. So again, You see a lot of that influence with like the arches, colors used, geometric shapes, and not really any more sculpture in these kind of buildings because religious reasons they did not really like to show people sculpted into things. So some famous ones, this is Humayun's tomb in Delhi, India. Agra Fort in Agra, India. We can see the influence here. Excuse me. Shalimar Gardens in Pakistan. And this is also kind of going back to Islamic architecture. If you remember from last week, we talked about how gardens were an important part, and not in like a Western sense of a garden, but a garden in Islamic architecture was meant as a place of respite with water elements and shade and places where you can kind of contemplate. So this is a very traditional Islamic garden. Here's the Red Fort in Delhi. Lots of Islamic influence, and this almost looks like it might be an old stepwell right here too as well. And lastly, I do want to touch on is that there is Sikh architecture in India as well. India has a lot of interesting architecture going on. Sikh architecture uses a lot of curves and straight lines, so we can see like, you know, straight lines, like it's very straight looking compared to a lot of like the old Indian, like the Hindu and the Buddhist temples. But this style is constantly changing even in modern times. This is, I believe, it's the Hamidinar Sahib in Punjab. I believe this is also called the Golden Palace. It's one of the more famous Sikh buildings. And they like to, I think it's, if I remember correctly, every day they cook food to feed anyone who wants to come and eat. So religious, civic, you know, they do a lot of good stuff there. And that is about it. Indian architecture is very interesting, and I think it's very inspirational. They have a lot of really artistic stuff going on, and I think it's a great one to study. I do recommend doing the reading, looking more into it, and taking some influences from it to help push your environment art even more. So if you have any questions, you can always ask me in class about this style, but hopefully you have enjoyed this presentation.